Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad we're finally able to talk. We've connected for quite a few months now over
Yeah,
my own personal account, so
yeah,
it's so exciting to
yeah.
finally
I
have
think
the
it's so cool because
opportunity to
I've been
chat with
following
you.
you for like I feel like it's been a couple of years at least. Like I remember your book launch and everything. And I have a book coming out in a few months too. So very excited about that. I'm sure you know the feeling.
Yeah, yeah, it
Oh
is
yeah,
a lot of
definitely.
work. It is it is not easy putting out a book, but it is some of the most
Absolutely.
rewarding work that you can do. Because I know the night before my book came out, I felt so vulnerable and I could not believe that I was about to like release my story out to the world and all of this work that I put into it. And then like right away, people started coming back and they were just so grateful for
Yeah.
having that book out there. So
Me too, me
I
too.
can't
Yeah,
wait to
I
read
believe
your
that
book.
vulnerability is the greatest strength, especially in the world we live in. I think the one of my favorite quotes ever is the opposite of cowardice in our society. I mean, the opposite of strength of courage in our society is not cowardice, it's conformity. And I just love that quote so much
Absolutely.
because I think the people that dare to be different, which is very aligned with our topic today, and embrace that different. I think that's the most courageous thing you can do. So yeah, I'm super excited to talk about autism and eating disorders,
Absolutely.
and everything we put on the agenda for today.
Awesome. Well, we'll go ahead and dive right in, and I guess we'll embrace vulnerability right away. But I would love for the audience to have an opportunity to get to know a little bit more about you, the awesome work you're
Yeah.
doing, and a little bit more about
Well,
your
it's always very
story.
hard for me to know where to start. But yeah, I guess to kind of make it short, growing up, I always knew that I was different. Like I felt like I never fit in. I pretended to like girly things. I faked gossip and pretended to play with dolls and did all the things that I thought girls did just to not feel isolated. But I mean, as you grow older, like it's not sustainable with any kind of feeling different. You do tend to gravitate towards loneliness at some point. And for me, when I was about 10 or 11, I just really reached a point where I just felt so lonely and so isolated. That's when my parents, who are now divorced, also started fighting a lot. I mean, at that age, school is a lot more demanding too. My sports were a lot more demanding. That I think very unconsciously, I kind of decided I'm going to eat healthier. And I think one of the earliest manifestations of autism into an eating disorder was around this time where in school we were learning about health and nutrition, and we were learning about if you eat cookies, it's unhealthy, too much sugar, right? And you have to choose the healthy snack, and you have to get X amount of minutes of exercise per day, kind of all these recommendations. And I took it so literally, I took it so to heart that I was like, I'm going to be an unhealthy person if I do not follow these recommendations. So I basically cut out like all of the unhealthy foods from my diet, and started just working out a lot. And I was like 11. This quickly caused me to lose a few pounds, and that basically sparked my eating disorder. So I was diagnosed with an eating disorder when I
Hmm.
was 11. Was forced in and out of treatment for almost a decade. Nothing worked. Everything made everything worse, because I never resonated with the body dysmorphia or the fear of weight gain. But in treatment, what often happened is the professionals would tell me, no, you are afraid of gaining weight. No, you are this. No, you do have body dysmorphia, which was just really gaslighting my experience. And this kind of conditioned me,
Hmm.
to learn what the therapists and everyone wanted to hear. So I would just make up stories, just so they would think I was being honest with them, which obviously caused the eating disorder
Wow.
to become much more ingrained, because that was my coping mechanism for the invalidation in the first place. Um, well, long story short,
Hmm.
in 2017, I was on like the edge of death, and I was like, I can't do this anymore. So I decided to recover. And then in 3 years later, when I was like really doing really well in my recovery, there seemed to be this piece missing. I was like, I'm doing so well, but still I want to attach numbers to things and engage in all these behaviors, or I still had these traits that a lot of the professionals always said, these are eating disorder behaviors you have to get rid of if you want to reach true full recovery. But it was actually impossible for me to separate myself from these things. So I started to think there must be something that everyone has missed, including myself. So I started reading a lot and researching, and in 2020, I read the book Asperger's by Rudy Simone, which is about the autistic female experience. And I've never read a book that fast in my entire life, because black and white on paper, no pun intended, was literally my entire experience, just like documented right there. And that discovering I'm autistic really gave me the permission slip to be myself and embrace these traits that were always tied to my eating disorder, but now they could just be part of me, and I could be separate from the disorder. So I always say that if recovery was like baking a cake, the autism discovery was like the cherry on top. It was like the final straw that I needed to go from like in recovery to I am recovered, past tense. So yeah, that's kind of my story. And now I help other neurodivergent people to recover from their eating disorders with the non-traditional and a unique approach that's really tailored to them and their autistic traits.
Yeah, that is a powerful story. So thank you for sharing that. There were so many things that just really resonated with me because I was thinking back
Yeah,
about with my battle with orthorexia, how
yeah,
it was very black or white thinking, and it was the same learning in nutrition
right,
class, what was healthy and what was unhealthy, and it just you become
yeah,
so obsessed with that, that I could really relate to that. And you spoke about the unique
yeah,
approach that's needed for an individual with
right.
autism who's also battling an eating disorder. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that. What recovery looks like, how the different unique approaches that we need to
Yeah,
take to for those
absolutely. So I
individuals
think
would look
the
like.
very traditional treatment model that it is used in the treatment centers is very psychoanalytical, right? You're gonna do DBT and CBT, and I'm sure you've heard of the Maudsley method before, of like when it's still a person under 18, the parents take over the meal planning and everything. And for me, I think all these methods are very just very cookie cutter, again, no pun intended, and very textbooky. Like, and as an autistic person, autistic people are very detail oriented, and we can pick up on when like things are just very systematic, I guess. And a lot of us have, I
Hmm.
guess, an inner rebel, that we're like, well, we're not going to conform to this. I think that's why there's also a lot of overlap with autism and neurodiversity and the LGBTQ community. And I thought a lot about why this is, and I think a lot of it is also because our minds are different, and we dare to be different and embrace that difference, I guess. Anyways,
Hmm.
a lot of the traditional treatment model is very aimed at getting rid of certain behaviors around eating, and just kind of completely eliminating those, and really believing that the root of these issues is some sort of unsolved trauma or something. But as an autistic person, I think the problem with the traditional treatment model is that they try and get rid of someone's autistic traits, and by labeling them as an eating disorder behavior, which makes the autistic person feel like they can only fully recover if they're not themselves, which is almost a form of masking,
Hmm.
which further causes that person to feel invalidated and turn to unhealthy coping mechanisms, and thus strengthening the eating disorder. So with the unique and tailored approach, I think it's really important to look at the individual as a person, in the sense like, what are your personality traits? Like, what are things you've always done in your life that maybe could be perceived as eating disorder behaviors, but that existed before the eating disorder, so that the therapist isn't trying to, or the caregiver or whatever, isn't trying to get rid of the person's personality inherently. Yeah, that's what I would say. And a
Yeah.
lot of the work I do is really like looking at how can we use your autistic traits to your advantage in recovery. Um, So like for example,
Mm,
like
mm-hmm.
numbers attachment and stuff, like a huge one that you see in eating disorder treatment is like if you want to fully recover, you have to completely stop attaching numbers to food, right? Like stop calorie counting, stop weighing food, throw away all the scales, everything that has to do with numbers, get rid of it. Was for me, that was like the most
Mm-hmm.
harmful thing anyone could have ever done for me because it caused me to like secretly have scales hidden everywhere because I wasn't allowed to do it.
Yeah.
But in the case of using that autistic trait to your advantage of like wanting to actually attach numbers, for me it was massively helpful to say, okay, I realize that it's actually easier for me to eat when I do know the calories. So instead of saying I can't eat more than this many calories, it's like I have to eat at least this many calories. And that actually helped me disentangle like the relationship of like counting calories equals restriction, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. You touched on so many important things right there. The one thing that I always think about when it comes to recovery is that we're reconnecting with that person that we were before the eating disorder. So it saddens me to hear that for so many people who have autism, for them to feel like they have to mask in order to recover. That just breaks my heart because if anything, you should be reconnecting with that authentic self inside. And the other thing that I found interesting there as I battle
Mm,
with obsessive compulsive disorder, and one thing that I've learned during my recovery is that there are aspects of my OCD
yeah,
that are strengths, and my therapist and my
yeah,
nutritionist have tapped into those and said, "Hey, society might say this is something that's quote unquote wrong with you, but actually this is who
yeah,
you are, and this is your strength." And that
yeah,
is a really powerful realization when you can realize that these different things that others might look at as disadvantages can actually
yeah,
be your
and
strength or your advantage
definitely. And you just
when it
like
comes to
the
it.
word disadvantage, and just I think that that short, those three letters dis. I mean, technically in the DSM-5, autism is labeled as autism spectrum disorder. But I think you just hit the nail on the head with saying like it doesn't have to be a dis. Like it could also be a really positive thing because
Yeah.
honestly, my like being autistic is the greatest gift. I think everything that I've achieved in life,
Hmm.
was me being autistic, and I've achieved that through my autistic creativity. And we even see like in throughout history, like Einstein, Isaac Newton, so many of these famous painters, like we wouldn't have the laws of gravity that we have today if it were not for the autistic mind. And even like the founder of Microsoft, like I always get confused, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, well, is
I
autistic
know.
too. And I think it just, yeah, like you say, like it, I think it's really sad and harmful when professionals try and say you need to get rid of that to be free. But I'm like, freedom is the freedom of being yourself without having to be enslaved to society's labels. Like the definition of being enslaved is not being free.
Hmm.
um so yeah, with the masking too, I think an eating disorder like in itself is almost a mask for of autism. I think that was what it was for me. So yeah, that's why I actually have a podcast episode coming out tomorrow titled "How Treatment Made My Eating Disorder Worse," and I dive into this about how eating disorder treatment actually conditioned me to mask even more, which of course just strengthened the eating disorder.
Awesome. Yeah, and everybody make sure that you're following Livia because
Thank
those
you.
podcasts are incredible. So that is definitely a podcast
Speaking
worth
of,
listening to. So
I
make sure to follow along.
Jason, you should come on
Um,
the podcast
yeah,
too sometimes. Yeah,
I would love to. I would absolutely love to. So
definitely.
thank you for the invite. We'll make that happen for sure. Yeah. All right. So, one other topic that when we were preparing for this live event today was
Yeah.
around interoception and where that kind of crosses over with autism and eating disorders. So, I would love for you to dive a little bit more
Mhm.
into maybe what interoception is and also, how it relates
Yeah,
to
so
the two
interoception
conditions.
is basically everyone's pretty familiar with like the five exteroceptive senses. So like touch, taste, smelling, hearing, sound, the five basic senses, right? But there are actually three more lesser known senses that are honestly just as important. And those are the vestibular sense, proprioception, and interoception. I'm not going to get into the other two because I actually have a podcast episode about that. But interoception is basically the state through which we monitor the inner state of our body, hence the name interoception, as opposed to exteroception. And so interoceptive awareness tells us like whether we are hungry or thirsty or too hot or too cold. And it really balances the need for change with the need to stay the same. So like if I'm wearing a sweatshirt and it's like super hot and there's like a heat wave, like I'm going to take off my sweatshirt because my interoceptive awareness is telling me like you are getting overheated. We need to make a change to achieve that state of homeostasis again. But the thing is with in individuals who are autistic, we often lack interoceptive awareness, so we're often unable to really interpret what our body is telling us. So for example, like if I am really hungry, I don't feel like a physical stomach rumble. Like hunger for me manifests in usually as mental hunger. But in society, when we're told like thinking about food is emotional eating, it can't be trusted, right? My autistic mind takes that really literally and is like, oh, this cannot be trusted, so I shouldn't eat. I'm not actually hungry, which of course leads to disordered eating behaviors. But I've been more hesitant about talking about studies and research now that I kind of know, as you know, like where that research is mainly coming from. But there actually was one study, unfortunately only done on the stereotypical thin white female, that did measure interoceptive awareness in people with anorexia. And people with anorexia tend to lack interoceptive awareness as well. But the question, of course, is then, is this lack of interoceptive awareness, was it existent before the condition, or is it a result of the anorexia? Because interoceptive awareness is regulated in part by our insula, which is a part of the brain, and when you're malnourished, your brain basically stops working correctly. So it's really a question of is that a cause of malnutrition, or is it actually a lack of interoceptive awareness? Was that present in the individual before? But yeah, I do see that huge overlap of lack of interoceptive awareness. I mean, in neurodiversity, because we see it a lot in ADHD too. Like people don't eat throughout the whole day and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm so hungry at the end of the day. And then it can turn into binging, and we see a lot of binge eating disorder in these kind of people.
Right.
So again, I think it's so important that we really start looking more like all eating disorders and like the whole spectrum, instead of like just anorexia and like the stereotype, because like binge eating disorder is also really common in autistic people because of that lack of interoceptive awareness as well. Like we will not eat the whole day because we don't know that we're hungry, but then when we finally do eat something, it's like, holy moly, I am so hungry, and you'll eat the entire kitchen. And then that becomes a habit because autistic people go towards ritual and routine, which is another overlap between eating disorders, right? So yeah, I mean, I could honestly talk for hours about the connection, but I hope I can answer your question about the interoception piece.
Yeah. Yeah, I learned a lot from that right there. And you brought up a good point. And before we wrap this up today, one thing that I wanted to point out is that we have seen that a lot of the studies and the research out there hasn't been all inclusive yet. But that is something that we're definitely hoping to see change here in the eating disorder community, because we want to make sure that all individuals are included. I know for me personally, as someone who had orthorexia, when I came on the scene, of course, it's not even in DSM yet, but it's like, hey, why aren't we talking about this more? Like, let's include this. So that is definitely something that we hope to see. And two other things that I want to get out there before we wrap this up is the first one, we had a question in the chat about avoidant restrictive food intake, and kind of how that could play a factor in autism as well.
Yeah,
so I was curious if you had any thoughts on that.
When you said like orthorexia isn't even in the DSM yet, honestly, because I think that a lot of the behaviors of orthorexia are socially acceptable in diet culture, right? But ARFID, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, is also a pretty new diagnosis in the sense that it's only been in the DSM since 2013. But basically a huge misconception, I guess, around ARFID is that that's like just picky eating or just fussy eating. But I actually did a podcast episode on ARFID with ARFID dietitian. Really good episode. So if anyone's interested in learning more about that,
We will check that out.
but we in our chat with Lauren from ARFID dietitian, we were talking about how ARFID is most likely a kind of an eating disorder that's almost like exclusive to the neurodivergent community. Like she said, like in her practice, she's almost never met someone with ARFID who like wasn't on the spectrum in some way. Because a lot of the characteristics of ARFID overlap with autism. And what is the difference with ARFID as opposed to like anorexia or like these other more well-known eating disorders is that with ARFID, a lot of the time the fear of food or the fear of eating comes with is due to usually trauma. So like they were exposed to a really traumatic experience as a child, which has almost hardwired their system to have a fight or flight response to food, basically. And something that I thought was also really interesting from my own research is that the insula, which is that part of the brain that is in part responsible for managing interoceptive awareness, also plays a major role in the primal emotion disgust. So when we are disgusted by something, it's usually like our insula is firing, which we often see in people with ARFID is that they're often disgusted by a lot of different foods. So that is another possible link. But of course, like you said, we need so much more research to tie these knots.
Yeah.
And I think the more people speak up about their experiences, and make safe spaces to come out and share about this, I think that is really the first step in I think any kind of change in the world.
Yeah. Absolutely. I totally agree. And that's why here at Anid, we are all about creating that safe space for people to share their stories, because that's how we make the change, after all, is when we hear these individual stories like you shared with us today. So here in closing, I would love to hear how people can connect with you. Where can they find you? And if there are any other additional resources out there for those of us who want to learn more about bridging that gap between autism and eating disorders. Any place we can look for more
on my
information?
Instagram, live label free, because we're all conveniently on there now. I have in my link in my bio, I basically have all my links in there to my website, my podcast, YouTube channel. You can get on the wait list for my my book, my memoir coming out. It's going to be called Rainbow Girl: My Journey to Living Life in Full Color. I have a cookbook also out called Nourishing Neurodiversity, and I have some free resources on my website as well. As I have a free audio training, which is called 3 Steps to Recovery from an Eating Disorder as an Autistic Person, in which I guide you, kind of like a personal on-demand coaching session, some steps and action steps you can take to help you use your autistic traits to advantage in recovery. And then I have some more like extreme hunger resources and courses on my website as well. So yeah, basically you can find everything through the link in my bio.
Perfect. We will check those out, and I cannot wait for your book. I cannot wait to join you on the podcast. I'm going to take you up on that invitation. But other than that, Livia, thank you so much for having this conversation today with me. This has been so educational.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And honestly, one of my fellow autistic ED warriors was telling me how I should do more live stuff. And he was saying that he knew you and had heard you as well, and I definitely would love to do a live with you on Live Label Free sometime as well, because I honestly, it's so fun.
All right, let's make this happen. I could keep this conversation going all day, so yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
All right, well, you take
Sounds
care,
great.
and
Bye.
we'll talk again soon. All right, bye everyone.